Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Viceroy of Verisimilitude, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your Chancellor of Cheerfulness, your existential Mr. Rogers. Robert Meyer Burnett here with Robservations, the show about something. This is episode number 332. Yesterday I said on the show it was 231. I misspoke. But today's episode is 332, my God. And I'm happy to be here with you, Robcasting from the Robservatory. And yeah, I know that's silly and probably self-serving, but it's fun. Doesn't it put a smile on your face? And, you know, all these nicknames other people hang on me, that's fun too. So here we are. And today's a show filled with mirth and mayhem. First of all, I would like to recognize the passing of FX Feeney. FX Feeney was a mainstay of the Los Angeles film scene for many, many years, and it was really unfortunate that he passed away of a stroke or a series of strokes. FX Feeney wrote a lot of Taschen books. Here's one of them that I particularly like. This was a book on Michael Mann. He's written books on Polanski, many different directors. He began his career. He graduated from Cal Arts, and he worked on the old Z Channel when it first started, the famous Z Channel that was one of the first great movie cable networks. So I'm very sorry to hear that he passed away. I'd met him a number of times at different film events, and he was always very, just a nice guy. And man, did he have an encyclopedic knowledge of film. So definitely wanted to acknowledge his passing. Now, there was, to follow up on my show yesterday about the Writers Guild and where we are at, there was a really interesting, in terms of streaming services and how people are going to get paid. There's a really interesting article that was in the Hollywood Reporter today by Ken Ziffrin. It's a guest column, and I wanted to share that with you because I definitely thought it worth sharing in terms of anybody who's interested in the entertainment business, how things are going to work in the future, where they might be going. And yes, Ken Ziffrin writes, how talent deals are evolving as studios become streamers. And this is a guest column for the Hollywood Reporter. Disney wants to be Netflix, yet the new contracts for stars and producers are causing entertainment lawyers to question which platforms are better for profit participants, writes a top attorney. Profit participation in the TV industry was born in the 1960s, when studios and independent production companies dominated prime time at the three networks. The definition of profits for creative talent working on scripted series has since evolved. In those early days, the production company owner of a show would simply charge large distribution fees, typically 30% to 40%, and overhead fees, 15 to 20%, which prevented stars, creators, and virtually all potential profit participants from reaching a defined profitability. Then, in the 1980s, the pendulum swung in favor of talent. A top writer-producer would go to one of the broadcast networks, secure production commitments for a pilot or series, and then turn to a studio for financing and distribution. Talent would even enjoy the benefit of the investment tax credit, which sheltered much of the production income. In those times, talent could negotiate for the elimination of almost all distribution fees and cap overhead charges so that on a successful series, they would be paid around the same time the studio achieved actual profitability. Then the ITC was abolished, and Fox decided to go into the broadcast business. A 3+ year battle between the studios and the networks ended in 1993 when the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the Department of Justice knocking out the FinCEN rules, which had prohibited broadcasters from owning or distributing their shows. That triggered a burst of M&A activity, resulting in several media, that would be mergers and acquisitions, several media giants. They charged distribution fees, 10% to 20% on off-net exploitation, and overhead fees, 10% to 15% on production costs, and began to license their shows to affiliated entities, like Fox, putting reruns on its own FX channel. Even when a competitive market would bring in more dollars and arguably viewers, This met resistance, which resulted in a concept called the imputed license fee. If agreed upon by the participants, it permits the producer, distributor, or exhibitor to assign fixed amounts or formulas, effectively inputting income rather than requiring the entity to maximize gross receipts. The resulting profit participations, called MAGR, modified adjusted gross receipts, are now employed by virtually all major studios, especially those that operate or are about to operate digital platforms like Hulu or Disney+. Yet another significant shift in how talent is paid came in the 2010s, when new entrants from Silicon Valley disrupted the ecosystem. These entities, Netflix and Amazon Prime as paradigms, made the costly decision to go after A-list talent with a radically different pay structure. First, they made clear that, unlike the major studios, any scripted programming that they developed and financed would be exhibited exclusively on their own platforms in perpetuity. The notion of traditional tiered distribution in the linear world would cease in favor of direct-to-consumer for digital, coupled with an imputed license fee. Second, they were willing to pay talent generously up front. Instead of contracting with top hyphenates for a yearly guarantee of 7 figures, they would actually commit to an 8-figure guarantee per year. In return, instead of an open-ended back-end deal that depended on how much the rights holder could obtain from unaffiliated downstream outlets, formulas were trotted out so the talent would be bought out for a fixed sum. And to the chagrin of the cognoscenti, the buyout bonuses were not necessarily based on performance. Just as Silicon Valley entrants were attracting more and more subscribers with a binge release model, star-studded programming, and easy-to-manage user interfaces, there was a corresponding loss for linear channels. Domestic ratings fell like a rock on broadcast networks, basic cable, and even premium pay outlets. The issue had to be addressed. Would or could the vertically integrated media giants dare to compete with Silicon Valley? And if so, how? What approach might they adopt in dealing with talent? Today, as we see spending on premium scripted content, both in production and marketing, rapidly accelerate, there has been a pronounced shift in the business models from linear to on-demand. The result thus far has been a race to the bottom for profit margins and free cash flow generation. Will the media giants treat profit participants in the same manner as the giant digital companies? A lot of this, by the way, feeds directly into what the Writers Guild is asking for and has been asking for years and years when it comes to streaming revenue. It is not a surprise that each vertically integrated media giant has chosen a different path. Disney, in November, Disney debuted its so-called Series Bonus Exhibit on deals for subscription offering, in particular Disney Plus and Hulu. The Series Bonus Exhibit rewards profit participants with bonus payments for longevity, starting with the second season. Current program rankings, with separate computations for linear or digital programming, awards like the Emmy or Golden Globes, library performance after production ends, and with separate accountings for merchandising licensing, unless the content is based on pre-existing Disney programming, traditional VOD rentals, and electronic sell-through, music, and publishing. Detractors maintain that the payouts are substantially less than can be earned on successful series with a traditional MAGR definition. They claim it may trigger singles and doubles, but never the home runs that have made prominent TV creators very rich. Disney, on the other hand, believes its formulations are more favorable. The SBE is worldwide. It substitutes for both Disney and off-Disney gross receipts in all media except as described above, and over-budget deficits are essentially absorbed by Disney. In certain situations, the participant can elect a MAGR measurement, but the SBE is the de facto form used by Disney, and now, thanks to its 2019 acquisition of Fox. Negotiating for an MAGR could lead to the most significant upside for participants. Warner Media, the digital formulation from AT&T's Warner Media unit, applies to Warner Brothers, Turner, and HBO outlets. A participant would receive an imputed license fee from HBO Max, the forthcoming streaming service, which is tiered and dependent on which of the 3 possible platforms are controlled by Warner. and when those platforms occur in sequential distribution. There are different rules governing episodes with a second window, but not a first window on an affiliated subscription service, and so on. Unlike Disney, once a participant has graduated from the license fee, the next step is to compute revenues from other territories or rights in an enhanced MAGR definition, as opposed to Disney's buyout bonuses. Here, the participant is tagged with budget overages. This structure seems more favorable than the Disney formulation, but only if the imputed license fee applies solely to domestic gross receipts. Anyway, this article goes on and on and on. And basically the point of this, I'm going to put this in the live chat in case you want to read all of it, because it's very, very interesting. When I read it, I thought about one thing. It basically screws everybody out of more and more of their money. And it's no wonder that the Writers Guild continues to fight for their rights to get paid. I mean, after all, it comes down to with now, what's really interesting, I think the thing that most people need to understand is when you have Disney Plus controlling basically no Disney programming. I mean, there's still Disney movies and Disney shows on other platforms, but all of that's going to go away. All of Disney Plus's material, everything that Disney makes, is eventually going to be on Disney Plus and nowhere else. As we know, already there's more subscribers than they thought. It's doing very, very well. So what happens is, if you want to make a show and Disney is going to make your show, and you go, great, Disney's going to make my show, they completely call the shots. You know, you can negotiate with them all you want, but there's no other downstream ancillary markets. Disney is not going to be selling their programming into other territories so it can make money in syndication in France and Germany and the UK. No, it's all going to be on Disney Plus. And whether you're going to get real analytics for how many people watch, it's all, this is the problem. This is really the crux of what the Writers Guild wants. They're like, look, if you have a show that is very successful on Disney Plus and say 100 million people watch it, end up streaming every episode, that's a lot of people. And yet, are you going to get rewarded for 100 million people? Now it's a global marketplace that are going to watch all these things? Or is it just going to be a one-time fee that you get paid? I mean, it's pretty, I don't like it. I don't like it because, you know, it again, like everything else, it turns into, everything is just flattened out, and excellence isn't necessarily rewarded, and it makes it so, okay, you know, you used to be able to make a real living. One of the problems that I have seen in my own life in terms of post-production is my editorial skills have only gotten better, but the money that I make editing just goes down and down and down. Now, sure, I am not a union editor, and I've never worked on union shows. And if I was a union editor, my wages would be protected. But I don't. I'm not. So it's frustrating. But let me just let me read the end of this. It's virtually impossible to predict which of these 5 companies is best for participants, let alone whether they will succeed in the streaming wars. After all, Netflix has been around for more than a decade and has yet to show $1 of free cash flow from operations. The new apps are costly to build, market, and stock with content, let alone to reward creatives on the back end. And that, I think, is the most important thing about all of this. In case I didn't do this, let me, here you go. Everyone says they're not making any money. You know, Netflix is leveraged to the hilt. I mean, I know their market value is what? Somebody said $160 billion or something, and they're making how many billions of dollars every year with subscriptions, but they're still borrowing more money. Where is the positive cash flow of the company? So creators, I mean, what happens if Netflix went down? What would happen to all of those shows? Would it be a fire sale? Would somebody just be able to buy those assets? I mean, it's crazy. Anyway, another thing I was thinking about. But I know that a lot of people probably aren't that interested. But I do find I'm fascinated by how my business is going to shake out with movies and television and any other kind of content that is being made for streaming services. How are people going to make, a living wage? A friend of mine, my good friend Darren Scott, I think it was Darren Scott who said this. Darren Scott, who directed Deep Blue Sea 2. I just saw with Rusty Cundiff, they've made Tales from the Hood 3, which I just saw in an early cut of it as it moves through post-production, that we've all become professional hobbyists. Because before, you used to have a hit show, you could live on that for a while. You could dine out on a hit show or a hit movie. Well, nowadays, it's harder and harder to do that. I know people say, oh, poor us, but it might take you, look, Tango Shalom, I've been working on it for 3.5 years. I'll never make what I would normally earn on that film. It's a low-budget indie movie. I knew what I was getting into, but I didn't know it would go this long. So the only thing I really get out of Tango Shalom is, one, the great satisfaction of having worked on it. Two, if we sell the movie and get it out there, that means great. Then I can go to somebody and say, hey, I just produced, edited, and post-supervised a film that Netflix bought or Disney bought or Hulu bought or whoever buys it. Hopefully they'll buy it, fingers crossed. And then I can ask, hey, I got something else. Can we go make this? And have people say yay or nay. It's just a different world. Very, very different world. But why should it matter to you? Perhaps it shouldn't. But it'll be interesting to govern where right now we're getting some really interesting and diverse programming because it's like the Wild West out there. And we're getting the Umbrella Academy, and we're getting The Boys, and we're getting Witcher, and we're getting more Star Trek shows. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Well, we're getting Doom Patrol. We're getting a lot of really interesting shows. I finished Netflix's The Stranger, the Harlan Coben new series on Netflix. That was, well, I could talk about that later at a later date, but sort of interesting. Anyway, Star Trek Picard, episode 3 aired. And, I think I'm going to take a different tactic when I talk about Star Trek Picard. I don't think I'm going to review the episodes anymore. Like when I talk about it, I'm not going to say whether or not they're necessarily good or bad or how I feel about them in terms of whether I like them or not. I think more I want to talk about questions and things that go through my mind as I watch these episodes. And one of the things that struck me as I watched Star Trek Picard episode 3 was the world building. Because one of the things, as I talked about on the show, that has fascinated me about science fiction, fantasy, and horror worlds, is the world building. And part of the great appeal of any science fiction, fantasy, or horror program or show or movie or book or universe, whatever you love, whether it's the MCU or Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, the universe that it's set in is half the appeal. Sure, it's always characters and story. And I always say never put your universe before your characters and your story, which is absolutely true. But once you have great characters and a good story, the universe becomes extremely important. The milieu becomes the special sauce that gets poured over the souffle of the characters and the story. And as I get further, 3 episodes into Picard, I have many questions. And the questions, I keep waiting to see some of these questions addressed because I think they are fundamental, foundational questions about the show itself. And these are, I'm going to go through, and it sort of applies to all 3 episodes now and where we are at in the show. As everyone knows by now, the Romulan homeworld was destroyed as witnessed in Star Trek 09. Now, this is the first time we've seen the Star Trek universe after that event, because before Star Trek 09 it had not happened. And when we had seen Star Trek futures, even though they were alternate futures and things like All Good Things, this event hadn't occurred. So, one of the things that I think that runs through my mind is, where exactly, in what state is the Romulan Star Empire in after the destruction of the Romulan homeworld? Obviously, the United Federation of Planets, in our universe, Vulcan was not destroyed by Nero, obviously. So while we haven't lost one of the founding member planets, I would wonder if the UFP, let's talk about whether it was Earth or Teller Prime or Alpha Centauri, or any of Andoria, Vulcan, if one of the main planets of the founding members of the United Federation of Planets was destroyed, would that cripple the rest of the Federation? Certainly, you would now have a planet lost, and you would have a whole group of people who are essentially homeless. But how would that affect the rest of the galaxy? Now, one of the things that's always bothered me all the way back, mostly it started with Next Generation, was that every time we saw an alien race, they all look the same, they dress the same. Sometimes you might get to see civilians, like in episodes like Sins of the Father or things like that. We saw Klingon civilians. In Unification 1 and 2, we saw Romulan civilians, even though they all had the same shape to their clothing. But it always sort of bothered me that the Federation was made up of all of these different worlds. And if you saw an episode like in the original series, Journey to Babel, there was world building there. Like suddenly, oh, there's this conference, and here we have a group of disparate aliens from different worlds. That's when we first saw Andorians, and we first saw Tellarites, mixing it up with Vulcans and other alien races that went nameless. And they were clearly going somewhere, and you realize through the course of the show, even just by showing them, oh, Federation that is going to this conference on Babel, the Babel conference, and you just by what they showed you, you got it. And actually, within that episode, they told a very interesting story about fathers and sons, especially the relationship between Sarek and Spock, and Amanda, his mother. Very interesting, but you also got so much interesting backstory in 52 minutes. This was great, rich, deep storytelling that worked on many different levels. Well, one of the things that since the status of the Romulan Star Empire plays into the Picard series, they have spent 3 episodes, which is basically, what is that, 90 minutes plus 43 minutes or whatever, 3 episodes, and we have no real understanding of the status of the Romulan Star Empire, where there's lots of Romulans running around. There's Tal Shiar and the Tal Shiar within the Tal Shiar. There's all kinds of, there's a Borg cube apparently in Romulan space. It's a reclamation site now that Romulans are working. But we really have no real understanding of what is the status of the Romulan people post the destruction of their homeworld. Where are they at? Where's their government at? Who's calling all of these shots? And I find that interesting that we have lots of Romulan characters, but we don't know anything about the Romulan geopolitical situation within the Romulan Star Empire. So far as they're portrayed, they're just being portrayed as generic bad guys. I mean, even in Nemesis, we got to see a little bit of Romulan politicking going on. And I find that frustrating because I don't know what I'm supposed to think about Romulans other than the fact that they're bad guys. That's it. I don't know anything more about the Romulan Star Empire. Obviously we know Nero was pissed off because of Star Trek 09, but and we know that certain Romulans obviously have a debt of gratitude toward Picard because he tried to help them, even though we don't really understand. And in this episode, we find out, and so I find myself wondering as I'm going through this, I'm like, okay, but you think about shows like Game of Thrones, where they dealt with the geopolitical situation, whether you're going from King's Landing to Marine, seeing what everybody was doing, you really got a sense of the players in Westeros. And in terms of world building, especially in the first 4 or 5 seasons of Game of Thrones, they really did a terrific job of jumping from place to place and really making the viewers understand where everybody was coming from. What was the geopolitical situation in Westeros at any one time? And that was obviously a big part of that show. The War of the Five Kings, or all of that, everything that was going on was very, very interesting. So to me, if you're going to do a show like Picard, you should be looking at shows like Game of Thrones to understand, okay, how do we establish what is actually going on? We have spent 3 episodes now, the last 2 episodes, and this one was no exception. There's a lot of talking and exposition, literally where people are sitting down, talking to somebody. They're just talking to each other. Now, the Romulans, as they have been portrayed, we've seen them beam in and start shooting people out in the open. In the case of this week's episode, the same kind of a Romulan hit squad shows up at Picard's house, which, I mean, they literally come in guns blazing, which seems a little counterintuitive with the amount of surveillance technology that probably exists in the 24th century. So, okay, I understand that there's an action scene. Now we're having a firefight, literally a gunfight with fisticuffs in Picard's house. And when I watch these things, I'm like, in the original Star Trek The Next Generation, the reason why you didn't have many firefights was because how expensive each laser blast was. It was really hard to do back then. They had to composite them. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford the actual work, so you couldn't have a really great firefight. Now, computer technology and all the technology, post-production technology, makes it far easier to have firefights. But I think to myself, okay, now we've now seen Romulans beam in to Daj's apartment. We've seen Romulans beam onto the roof of Starfleet headquarters, I guess. We've seen Romulans, I guess, beam down outside of Picard's house and bust in and try and shoot up the place. And thank God there were Romulan operatives there. But I wonder, I'm like, is this the best use of storytelling? These kinds of firefights. They seem a little retro, I guess. These are questions that I just wonder. Why are we doing this? It seems sort of very un-Star Trek to have gun battles every episode. I guess I'm all for action sequences, but these action sequences are, and then of course, knowing that they have, let's just say, space cyanide that will dissolve you, when they sit somebody down to interrogate them, Picard has already watched somebody break one of these capsules and disintegrate. You'd think they'd do a little bit more when the situation arose to interrogate another one of these people to make sure, or to take precautions that doesn't happen. Those are the things that bother me. Another thing that bothers me is the Borg. We know, of course, I'm not spoiling anything, that you know that there is a cube, a Borg cube, that was cut off from the collective. We learn a little bit more about that now. Well, now here's the thing. We've known from classic Star Trek that Borg technology, people have to keep some of their implants, but we learned that human beings, or any creature apparently that was assimilated by the Borg, can be freed from the collective. And the first person we saw this work out on was, in fact, Jean-Luc Picard in the 4th season Next Generation opener, Best of Both Worlds Part 2. They liberated Picard. They were able to free him of all of his Borg implants, and he could go on his merry business. Well, they've sort of changed that over the course of Star Trek through mostly Voyager. We learned about things, Unimatrix Zero. We learned a lot about the Borg and how it all worked. Now, here's the thing that I guess I don't understand about the way Picard is portraying the Borg. Now, it was pretty cool. I think one of my favorite elements of the 3rd episode was seeing Jonathan Del Arco come back to play Hugh. And Hugh, of course, we saw Hugh first in the 5th season episode I, Borg. He came back in Descent Part 1 and 2, and now he is, of course, on Picard. Liked seeing him, thought he did a great job. But here's the thing. The Borg, first of all, let's all talk about the elephant in the room. The Borg were pretty stupid when they were first designed by Maurice Hurley. The idea is like cyborg, yeah, I'll just call them the Borg. And so the idea of the Borg was, one step away from Doctor Who's Cybermen that I know they've been made more interesting over the years. But the Borg were pretty silly as villains in their original conception. Now, what was interesting about the Borg, the thing that made the Borg so fascinating in Q Who, in the second season episode of Next Generation Q Who, is that there was no central figure to fight. They literally were like a natural disaster. Somewhere in the distant past, the Borg were created, in my own mind, in my own headcanon. There was some horrible mishap that probably, transhumanism, something happened with all the best intentions, and something went horribly awry. Maybe Skynet, instead of Skynet taking over the defense systems of your planet and blowing up humanity, maybe people that were improving themselves, bettering themselves, maybe in a quest to live hundreds of years by replacing your body with cybernetic implants or things. There was an AI accident, and the lovely people that were trying to do this were suddenly taken over by some kind of a horrible event, and the Borg were inadvertently created. I like to think of them as kind of the techno virus that you saw in the New Mutants that created characters like Warlock, and that the character of Cable was always holding at bay, the techno virus. The Borg, what happened was it was a techno virus that was given, it became ambulatory with human beings and technology or whatever, a humanoid life. And we've seen babies, I know I've seen images of fans have made Borg tribbles and things like that, but I've always thought that the Borg was very interesting when you first saw them, and so scary because they didn't care about the individual. They wanted to come and assimilate and take what they could to incorporate it into their own distinctiveness and use it to continue on. It was like the plague of locusts that has descended upon Africa even today. There's a huge locust outbreak, or what do you call them? Locust storm, plague of locusts. It's like that. That's kind of what the Borg were, and why they were so scary was because there's nothing you could do about it. It's not like you could appeal to their any kind of sympathy or compassion because they didn't have it. It didn't exist. And of course, that becomes problematic from a dramatic standpoint. So, in Best of Both Worlds, their conceit was, well, you pesky humans, before we need to make this transition easier, so we're going to create somebody you can deal with more, so we're going to give you Jean-Luc Picard and turn him into Locutus. Well, that kind of defeated the purpose, but that began, in my mind, a long descent into neutering the Borg as villains. They became more dramatically interesting because we could have lots of ex-Borgs and deal with what they've gone through. Now, one of the things that I don't understand about how the Romulans, and we met Romulan ex-Borgs. We met apparently a very renowned Romulan writer, scientist, last night, that she was on the last ship encountered by this Borg cube, and she was assimilated, and she's one of their great minds, and we meet her. But the way that the Borg are being treated on the show seems odd to me, because the victims of assimilation, I think of them as people that had a virus, basically a form of cancer, and they were brought back from the brink, and they are people that should be, now they're either second-class citizens, they're called XBs. Why that is, why somebody who was once a Borg, and if you're able to pull them back, why they would be treated anything less than the kind of people they were when they started out, doesn't make any sense to me, especially when you have the pinnacle of Borg reclamation would be Jean-Luc Picard himself. So once that happens, people should, I think, be able to lead pretty healthy lives afterwards. We saw that Seven, while she went through her own trials and tribulations, so to speak, Seven was able to do it. And I feel that they, like with a lot of what I'm seeing in Star Trek Picard, a lot of the concepts that they're presenting to us are very superficial in terms of how they're being dealt with on the show. Now everyone says, "Oh, Rob, we're only 3 episodes in." How do you know? Well, next week we're going to get the female order of Romulan monks or whatever it is who are training Legolas. I don't know yet. We're gonna see all of that. So they're adding all of these concepts, but I don't think that they're really thought through. And I was watching Gary Beekler's review of episode 3 of Picard, and he brings up a really good point. On last night's episode, we see an EMH. Now, we have seen holographic societies both on Deep Space Nine and in Voyager. Now, there's a lot of talk about how the Romulans are they don't have AI, or they don't have computers or synthetic life forms and all of that, which I don't know how anybody could become a spacefaring race with quantum singularities powering your ships and not be using very, very sophisticated computer technology and AI technology for stellar navigation. Because remember, when you're traveling through space, as we know from Star Wars, traveling through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy. It's incredibly dangerous. If you have a warp drive imbalance, you get sucked into a wormhole, right? Well, think about what you're flying in space. You have to be mindful of asteroids, moons, dust clouds. All of these things traveling at faster than light speeds could destroy a ship. So imagine the kind of computational power that starships would have to have in their main computers in order to have celestial navigation. And you would have to have AIs. I mean, people think that climate models are complex. Can you imagine when you're traveling through parsecs of the galaxy that how difficult stellar navigation would be without the most sophisticated computer technology ever? Also, you have to have navigational deflectors sweeping away all of this debris. So the whole idea that, and of course we already know from the 3rd season Next Generation episode, The Defector, that there are Romulan cyberneticists. Now I understand you can say all of these things, but the problem that I have, it goes back to world building. When you say something like this, you have to say, okay, if you're presenting me facts A, B, and C, well, that means that logically you've set me up to if I'm going to run that down, that D, E, F, and G must also be true. We know that about our lives here on Earth. We know that there's gravity. So we know that if you throw something off a cliff, it's going to fall. We understand that. Now, the reason you don't throw pennies off the Empire State Building is because a penny can fall and hit somebody. Now, you might never have seen that happen in real life, but I would hope that you wouldn't throw a penny off the Empire State Building. Maybe a penny wouldn't reach that kind of velocity, but you know what I mean. You throw something, you understand gravity, so you don't do it. You don't do it. So when someone says to me, okay, you have an EMH, and an EMH is artificial intelligence. It is AI. So we saw last night, there's another, there's an EMH that has an accent, delightful character, I suppose, but is an EMH a synth? And I asked myself as I was watching this, I'm like, okay, so you don't like synthetic life forms. Are you defining a synthetic life form as only somebody that has been anthropomorphized into a human being? Why would necessarily a synthetic life form, the way I have understood it now, is it's only one specific kind of synth that's been outlawed. But aren't EMHs synths as well? I mean, how do you define the difference? Now we know Daj and her sister Soji are, I guess, they're biological, but they have positronic brains. We don't really know what they are. But so Starfleet has banned synths. But have they banned holographic life forms? We've seen a lot of holographic life forms in Star Trek. We've seen EMHs. Now, EMHs are controlled by artificial brains. They are, in fact, AI. They can think, they can reason. So is an EMH, is a hologram considered a synth? And is that only because a synth has only been anthropomorphized into a human being? Wouldn't there be synths that didn't look human? we've only seen, okay, one kind of android. So when you throw these terms around, there's a whole group of logic questions that are immediately, I think, posed by just having these things. Like, okay, synths are outlawed. Right, because we've seen one kind of humanoid-looking synth has revolted. But are there other kinds of synths that aren't? Are only human-looking humanoid synths? Why would there just be humanoid synths anyway? Why wouldn't you make a submicroscopic synth that could do work like you could swallow a pill? And the pill would be full of, say, millions of We've seen nanobots. We've seen nanotech life forms on Star Trek. Somebody corrected me. I remember the name is Exocomp. We've seen the Exocomps on Next Generation. We've seen many different forms of machine life, AI life, and Star Trek has dealt with that in many different ways. And very interestingly, I might add. So this idea about synths and revolts and being reprogrammed, and then we're watching an EMH yesterday. My question was, and it was funny because I didn't really articulate it, but I was thinking something bothered me about it, and it wasn't until Gary Beekler brought it up on his review of this episode of Picard. And I'm like, okay. And so one of my problems with what we're watching is I don't feel that the writers of the show have thought these things through. And that's not just a criticism of Star Trek Picard. I feel that's a criticism of a lot of media sci-fi. And I don't usually have that criticism of literary sci-fi because when you are reading a book, they will spend pages explaining exactly where they're coming from. David Mack, in his trilogy about the Soong androids, beginning with the cold equations, goes into this in depth, talks all about it. You know, what does it all mean? Where does it all come from? And to me, just calling synths, and maybe it'll be more, it'll be extrapolated more. Alison Pill's character is supposedly going to be revealed as being transgendered. Maybe she's Bruce Maddox turned into someone else. I don't know. I mean, that's going to be really interesting because I do think the question of synths, the question of transhumanism and what it means to be a Borg drone, all of these things, sort of the collective, the overall, the collective intelligence, all of these things kind of feed in. Now, they're all interesting topics on their own. I just wonder, the question I would pose to all of you is, do you feel that these things, like, we live in a world where so many things, somebody says synths, we have many different versions of it. We've got Cylons from Battlestar Galactica, both the toasters and the human-looking Cylons. We've got Blade Runner, the replicants, I want more life father, or I want more life fucker, depending on which version of Blade Runner you watch. We have movies like Ex Machina, which really is a version of the apocalypse, because there we have machine life literally being tortured by a human being, and then the chickens come home to roost. And so there's a lot of to me, the idea of artificial life and synths has become a trope, a sci-fi cliche. And I'm thinking, by the way, there is, of course, you fans of Dune know all about machine uprisings and what happens in that world. And the Butlerian Jihad, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's something that clearly the writers, and I would think Michael Chabon's influence, he probably is the person that's been injecting a lot of Dune, maybe not so much in Discovery, maybe it was Akiva Goldsman, I don't know. Now, Michael Chabon once said, famously, I thought, and he's, again, I have his books up on my shelf here, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, one of the most fantastic books ever, and if the what is it? The actual title is the Yiddish Policeman's Secret Union. Is it Secret Union? I can't see all the way up there. Another fantastic book. He has won a Hugo and a Nebula. He's an incredible writer. And he once said that great literature, it's on a clip on YouTube when he's talking, he says great literature must transcend its genre. And how I feel about Star Trek Picard is the show is piling one science fiction trope on top of another, and yet it's not transcending what these tropes are. As a matter of fact, I think it's leaning heavily into those tropes and using those tropes as shortcuts, like Romulans coming in with guns in now 3 of the episodes. Literally, these armored up Romulans with blasters are coming in, and you would think, again, if you can beam somewhere, people can walk around the planet now. If you can beam somewhere, why not, instead of going into a room and trying to attack people, why not just stand outside the door, lock onto their coordinates, and beam them away? Why the gun battles? I mean, it also moved the plot forward. So these are things about Star Trek Picard that are irksome to me, and I know that there's a lot of people that are liking Picard, because I'm getting, I get in these Twitter conversations where people really dislike me because of my opinions about these things. But it's not, I don't want to hate Picard. I don't. It's not something, it's just that if you are going to do these things, we have had movies. Look, whether you believe in Brian Fuller's assessment he told me about Blade Runner 2049, or not. I really enjoyed Blade Runner 2049, and the questions it had to deal with about whether or not replicants could reproduce is something that it's obviously goes all the way back to Metropolis in a way, and then we dealt with that on Galactica, and that was always the prize. So there's a lot of really interesting ramifications to all of this, but I just feel that Star Trek Picard has become it is very one-dimensional, and I'm surprised Michael Chabon should do better. He wrote last night's episode, and when we're introduced to characters who have, say, drug addictions, they're vaping. Rafi, Picard's former compatriot, who we meet, and we hear about her backstory. She apparently gets fired because Picard resigns, so she gets fired, and with all this transporter technology, she's living in a trailer in Vasquez Rocks. I mean, was that clever? They've been using Vasquez Rocks as a location to shoot Star Trek on since the first season of the original series. And they literally go to Vasquez Rocks, which is a national park. It's parkland, and you see somebody living there in a trailer. With all the transporter technology, Picard never, after this woman got fired because of him, he never just beamed over at her and walked up and said, "Hey, what's up?" in 20 years. I mean, you want to know, like, okay, these people, if you're going to create static between people and you're going to say that there's 20 years between them, they didn't dislike each other. They worked together. I mean, I'm having a problem with, and these problems for me compile over and over and over. I mean, there's just one problem upon another problem upon another problem. Like, for instance, we meet this new character. We meet a new character last night. The Han Solo of the show, the Malcolm Reynolds of the show, and let's see. His name is, it's Santiago Cabrera as Rios. So Rios is your new dashing character. When we first meet this guy, he literally has the tip of a batleth or something coming out of his shoulder, but he's on a ship. So was he in the holodeck and he took all the safety controls off? Like, where was he? Why does he have a huge piece of metal protruding from his shoulder? And you see the EMH program there. You don't really know. Like, what was up with that? Did he just fight off people off of a ship? Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess it makes him a badass, and he has sort of this. I mean, is he having a same-sex relationship with his EMH program? There's a lot of interesting things going on in there. So these are the things that I think that where Picard is going, it interests me, and I'm like, okay, this is all, despite the fact that it's a sequel to so many different episodes of Star Trek. It's the world building. It's the rudimentary nature of the world building and all of these things. They're piling one on top of another, and I feel myself scratching my head. I don't usually feel this way with good science fiction, good televised science fiction, fantasy, and horror. you don't think about these things. And I find myself, now people could say, well, Rob, you're thinking too hard. Am I, though? I mean, they want to be bringing up all of these episodes. They're definitely touching on everything is analogous to our real world, and they're dealing with refugees and political opponents and secret police and conspiracies and all of that. But in a classical Star Trek episode, they would deal with one of these elements and tell a story about one of these elements and deal with it. But in this, they keep piling on and piling on and piling on and piling on, and they're creating all of these things. And I keep asking myself, okay, are we going to examine any one of these really interesting ideas? I mean, obviously, Soji, the twin girls one of them was called the Destroyer. They're having Mandelas, and so is she Shiva? And now we've got the Romulan mystic, former Borg tarot card reader. What does all of that mean? It's all very. All of it feels like it's come from somewhere else, and it's this mishmash of things, and it just keeps making me ask myself these questions. So, without reviewing Star Trek Picard Episode 3, I figured these are the things that I think about. This is my thought process. And a lot of people, are always throwing at me, I brought up the point that Star Trek Picard's 43 minutes long, and I said today that episodes like Yesterday's Enterprise and Measure of a Man and Chain of Command Parts 2 and Best of Both Worlds, these are 45 minutes of story, but we got a lot of story. The economy of storytelling in Star Trek, and people say, well, Rob, this is a story being told over 10 episodes. Yes, but within the 43 minutes of each Star Trek Picard episode, I need to have a lot of story told to me, and I feel we're not getting that. We've seen 3 episodes that could have been pared down into one, and that's been, my problem. And I understand storytelling has changed, but we're getting these long scenes of exposition and 3 gunfight scenes, and we're not getting a lot of, or people literally talking without going places and doing things, that I want more. I expect more from Michael Chabon who says, look, great literature should transcend genre. Well, Star Trek has kind of become its own genre, which I understand, which means this show should absolutely transcend Star Trek. It needs to be better, and I think it can be better. And it frustrates me that I have these questions. It frustrates me that there's all of these. They have dealt with the Borg on Voyager. Even if you go back, I mean, Kirsten Beyer, obviously, I'm not seeing her name other than on the first episode. Her name was not showing up other than the show creator, but not in the writing credits of these episodes. Kirsten Beyer has dealt with a lot of these issues in her Voyager Star Trek novels, which is why it's even doubly frustrating to see a lot of this not being dealt with. And when they're bringing it all up, when you're showing me the plight of ex-Borgs, when you are doing that, what you are doing is all the way back to Q-Who, through Voyager, even through the Borg episode of Enterprise, when you are doing that, then you're bringing with you all of those expectations for the savvy viewer. And they figure, we don't need to. I'm not talking about bogging it down with continuity, but I'm talking about the Borg as conceptually, how have they been done? And we've seen ex-Borg. We've seen holographic societies, and we've seen synths. How are you dealing with all of that? And when you say that a spacefaring race doesn't use AI or computers except for mathematical equations, it's like, well, that makes no sense at all, because you'd be using AI in all different kinds of things, in all aspects of society. So these are what I really object to, is these half-baked notions, because great science fiction, they don't let you understand. You get it. Blade Runner was very clear. When you're watching Blade Runner, these people, these replicants, who we as an audience know, yeah, they're portrayed as villains at first, but clearly they have souls. And the whole point of the entire movie is they, ultimately, the replicants, are us. We want to talk to Eldon Terrell, and we want to say, hey, man, I want more life. Why a 4-year lifespan? Can't you fix me? I mean, that's why it works. That's why science fiction works, because it makes you ask these questions, and in the entertaining context of the prism of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, you get to deal with the tough issues of things like morality and mortality, but wrapped up in that delightful, juicy sci-fi center of all these genre tropes that we love to just tear our teeth into. And it doesn't offend people from different political sensibilities because it's science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which is one of the reasons the genre can transcend political ideologies. And it makes it interesting when you're discussing things as far as Star Trek goes. Like, I keep asking people, I'm like, hey, man, you want to talk about Star Trek? Come to the show. Come talk. Come hang out. You know, don't just go, oh, I hate you, Rob, because you seem to hate these things. I don't hate them. What I want them is to be better. I want Star Trek. I want the Star Trek Picard show that Michael Chabon promised me when he signed on as showrunner. He didn't promise me personally, but you think the man who writes the books that he writes, the man who wrote Cavalier and Clay, where's the Cavalier and Clay version of Star? That's what I thought I was going to get with Star Trek Picard. And what I'm getting is warmed over sci-fi tropes from everything else. And yeah. So, there you go. I don't know what to say after that. Let's see what you have to say. How about that? Oh, wow. Willow Yang is here. Willow Yang says, thank you for showing us the full-size rocking machine yesterday in all of its big, throbbing glory. I hope I didn't get your video demonetized. Well, Willow, I heard you weren't even here when I brought it out for you. But no, apparently my video was not demonetized. My videos, for whatever reason, are getting demonetized even before I go on. And then I have to request, and that one beat the rap. So, by the way, it's just a sculpture. It's not like it's pornographic. It's not a sex toy. I mean, I think it would, if you try to use it as one, it would probably break. The fiberglass would shatter. Mataween is here, sending a super chat. Says, Ari Picard, why does Laris have an Irish accent? Just because the actress is Irish? I'd love to see a spin-off with Laris and Brenna Odell of the Bringloidy. Yes, that would actually be funny. I don't know why. Why does the EMH have the accent it has? I don't know. Fred Wicks sent in a super chat and says, thanks for the timeout. Polite opinions banned. Oh, I didn't see that. Did did one of my moderators time you out? I don't know. I didn't find out where that is. Wes Moody Webcast sent a super chat and said, I wonder where they set the Vasquez rocks. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was another thing. You go to a location that's a famous Star Trek location, which usually stands in for an alien planet. It's been Vulcan. It's been, the Metron, the Metron's homeworld or whatever, where they picked the Gorn and Kirk to fight. Vasquez rocks. They shot a little Ashore Leave up there. So many Star Trek episodes. But in Picard, it's like, Vasquez rocks. It's just like, wait, what? I mean, I get what they're doing, but why wasn't that like an alien planet? It was weird. You know, Gary Beekler called it, I forget what he called it, but I was thinking that's like the Palmdale of Earth. Like, what? And Picard, apparently you could beam there, so why didn't you go there before? Eduardo Barral sends in a tip. The Romulans let themselves be assimilated by the Borg to save themselves, and they are trying to find out where the Borg are to retrieve their people. I think they're going in that direction, but the story building in Picard is weak at best. That's interesting. I didn't consider that. What an interesting way to save your people. Come on, Borg. Please assimilate us. That doesn't seem like the greatest use. I mean, you have a star. This is again, one of my objections. You have an entire star empire. We know it's not just Earth. What about the Tellarites? What about everybody in the Alpha Quadrant? You know, what about the Klingons? You know, there's plenty of people with ships. The Andorians. It just seems so strange. We're going to build this fleet. As I said, why not use transporter technology? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But, it would seem to me that, what do you do? Call the Borg? I mean, the Federation, hey, Borg, can you come help us out and assimilate our planet and take them so we can come get you later? That doesn't seem like the best use. And they're not treating the XBs very nicely. I don't know why. Factual Opinion says, what are your thoughts on the Vulcan arc in Enterprise Season 4? The way Vulcans acted in the first 3 seasons didn't bother me. I thought it was interesting with them being jerks. I thought so too. I mean, one of the really interesting things is a lot of people complained about the Vulcans being our adversaries in Enterprise. I thought it was really interesting. I like that idea because, of course, humanity, when they after first contact, were the dregs of we're living in the post-atomic horror, and the Vulcans find us. They're like, we're not going to let you guys have warp drive. You're barely out of your last nuclear world war. So why, that made sense. I love the Vulcan arc, beginning with the Reeve Stevens, who have written some of my favorite Star Trek novels, wrote the first episode of that arc, The Forge. I thought it was great. Really enjoyed it. I really liked seeing T'Pau. I mean, I thought that Vulcan arc was like fan service done correctly, and it was also really interesting. It expanded the Star Trek mythology, and while I had questions, I still found it very satisfying. So I thought it was pretty good. Bob Kowal, Attic Hatch, sent in a tip, conceding exceptions. Given how homogenous many alien cultures are depicted, is sci-fi often speciesist? I loved South Park's take that Earth was a reality show platform forcing together disparate races and species from typically homogenous worlds. Well, yeah, I think, look, one of the problems with showing alien races is that it's expensive from a broadcast standpoint. And I think everybody sort of understands that, yeah, man, we can't show all the different kinds of, I mean, they're getting better, but it's sort of irksome that, that only, I mean, we only have people that live on Earth to act in these roles. I mean, I did think one of the things I will say that I really liked about the Kelvin Universe Star Trek movies is the aliens that we saw serving around the ship. Real aliens. It excited me in Star Trek The Motion Picture, the pre-release, the lead up to that movie, and a lot of the artwork and a lot of the publicity photos. They had all different manner of aliens, and obviously we didn't see much of them in the final film because they didn't look as good as they probably should have. But they were really interesting, and I would have liked to have seen more. That was something I really appreciated about Star Trek The Motion Picture, that they at least addressed. And I thought that the Kelvin universe, the Kelvin timeline in Star Trek, the one thing that I really liked about all 3 of the movies was the addition of alien races being ubiquitous everywhere. But yeah, I think it's a production problem that has always been, it's always plagued Star Trek, which is why, most of the time when you see Klingons in their military ships, that everybody is wearing the same uniforms, because it just, from a production standpoint, it's difficult. But yeah, I mean, I think look, at the end of the day, I do understand that it's we Earthlings that are making these shows, so we only have the resources that we have. And if they were going to go and do, say, Sebulba on a Star Trek show and have him walk around, or General Grievous or something like that, that's a completely CG character, that's rough and it's expensive and it's hard to do. So I do, I think, I don't know if it's so much it doesn't happen a lot in literary sci-fi. You get a lot more interest in literary sci-fi. Tim the Spider Monkey is here. We seem to be doing a lot of thinking about the meanings and implications of modern Trek, and that's the problem. The audience is doing more thinking than the writers of the show are. We want Star Trek, and they're giving us visual noise. I'm almost done. Look, I feel the same way. Looking at the preview of next week's episode, there's really not a whole lot for me to latch onto. I mean, you go back and you look at Measure of a Man, second season episode, and on the Blu-ray, you can watch the extended version of it. If you watch Measure of a Man, they do a really interesting job delving into what Data is. Existentially, what is he? And how is he going to be defined by the Federation moving forward. They're leaning heavily into Bruce Maddox's character. Like, Bruce Maddox has he become some kind of a megalomaniac? Is he actually Allison Pill's character? Is she, after transitioning? Is he Colonel Kurtz that's gone up the river somewhere? Are we going to find out that this is all really, everything that's going on is just happy and all of that? But next week we're going to meet I'll tell you something. As many other reviewers have pointed out, one of the things I really don't like about this show is the antagonistic relationship that Picard has with every woman on the show except his Romulan housekeeper, and they know better than him. I think it's a really interesting, one of the great things. Like, look, I understand Jadzia Dax was a Trill, and she had been other genders before. But one of the things I always loved about Deep Space Nine was the scenes between Sisko and Dax. I love that stuff. And there was no sexual tension there. And you just had characters. I mean, every single person on this show is either showing Picard some kind of pity or yelling at him. And you'd think this is one of the most respected people in all of the Federation. And yet he's given no respect by anyone. And it's strange. It's odd. And of course, I mean, I don't know. But I agree with you, Tim. I think that there's a lot going on in the show that I find difficult to watch because none of it's very nonsensical. It seems very forced to me overall with everybody. And now we're getting the most generic action adventure crew going off on a space mission that I can imagine. I mean, hey, you know what? Let's have Rafi vape. Like, really? I mean, really? All right. I guess they haven't seen all the ads in YouTube that tell you how dangerous that is. Oh, hi, Rob, says Joseph. Sends in a tip. Do you think we will hear a Majel Roddenberry sound-alike voice as a computer in Picard or future shows? We got Elcars, but would love to hear that computer voice again. Also, I would love to see Sela or Dinatra again in Picard. You know, so would I. The funny thing about this is that knowing that all these people are around, Dinatra, first of all, Dina Meyer, another one of my mom, right up there with Grace Kelly and Sharon Stone. I'm a huge, huge Dina Meyer fan. I love her. She's a redhead. She's so cute. And I loved her as Dinatra. Bring her back. Bring Sela back too. Like, again, show me the Romulan government. I really want to see what's up with that. You know, what's going on? Maybe we'll see it. I don't know. I agree with you, Joseph. Rosetta Allen sent in a super chat. I love the logical arguments you make. Such knowledge. Well, Rosetta, I don't know if I would say that I have such knowledge. I'm just you know what I am? I'm a student of storytelling. And when you're making movies and as my job as an editor, I'm constantly asking myself logic questions. You know, even when I'll tell you something, when you're an editor, even if you're having people who move around the room having a conversation, you have to make sure from cut to cut. Like, if you cut away, if somebody's walking around a room, right, and you cut away to the other person that they're talking to who might be sitting down, you have to make sure that when you cut back to that person, wherever they are in the room, works. Because if they've moved too far, the audience will be like, oh, that was jarring. It wasn't a jump cut necessarily, but they couldn't have covered that distance from the time that we'd been on that other character. So being an editor is to be a person that is constantly asking yourself logic questions about scenes. Always. That's one of the things that you're doing all 100% of the time. When you're editing a chase scene or an action sequence, every movement, can a fist have gone this far through the frame in this many frames? How fast does a fight go? If someone gets thrown across the room, how long does it take before they can actually get up, dust themselves off, and jump back into the fray? And I ask myself this all the time when I'm watching television. These are logic questions, and I think what is frustrating is when you have people who have a very cursory, they're treating science fiction and science fiction concepts in a very cursory manner, in a very superficial manner, like everyone's just supposed to understand synths. Now, I'm not saying we needed Basil exposition to walk on, but since so much of this is about the Romulans don't like synths, synths are banned, well, why? Okay, there was a synth uprising, but they were hacked. Wouldn't there be all kinds of synthetic life all over the place? And aren't holograms? What about EMHs? You know, an EMH, what if an EMH, apparently an EMH until it's on isn't a threat, but what if an EMH group of EMHs figured out, you know, they're in sick bay working all the time. Who knows what they would conjure up? And EMHs, they can beam across the celestial plane. You know, synths have to like travel on airplanes or spaceships or shuttlecraft or wherever. But if you had a revolt of a holographic, what if the EMHs decided to revolt? Then what? In solidarity of their synth brothers. I mean, I need what is a synth anyway? I don't think they know. You've cloned somebody from a positronic matrix. Like, well, okay, that's not going to get you flesh and blood. It's just silly. I need to know. Ron the Good Boy sent in a super chat. Ron, I'm glad you're a good boy. Thank you for the super chat. That English gent sent in a super chat. Gary Beekler said it best. It's Star Trek for people who don't like Star Trek by people who don't know Star Trek. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is I think they know, like someone said, okay, Michael Chabon has won a Hugo and a Nebula. He has, but as he also said, that his books transcend genre. And they do. They're marvelous. And I would recommend anybody pick up any of his books. I think I have his book on fatherhood. He wrote a book about, and it was fantastic, about being a man, basically. It was a great book. He's a wonderful writer. But when I was watching last night, I'm like, dude, you've just got people talking to each other, and then you have yet another gunfight with these Romulans. I mean, you'd think Picard might say, hey, man, there's Romulans all over Earth. You know, everyone's coming to my vineyard. Allison Pill's showing up. And, you know, Allison Pill just arrived just in time. Like, apparently she beamed in. Come on, let's face it. She beamed in with her Romulan compatriots. I mean, come on. It's like, really? Apparently everyone's going to Chateau Picard. Yeah, so I think yes. I think one of the problems with the show is the concepts, again, the superficial nature of their science fiction conceits is, I think, a huge problem. And it's becoming irksome as the show goes along because it keeps piling one thing after another. You know. Alexander Wilson is here. Hello, sir. I used to really like the show Entourage, but when I watch it now, I just don't think it's a good show. It hasn't aged well at all. What piece of art you liked, but as time passed, its quality diminished over time in your mind? That is a great question. What piece of art has diminished? Gosh, you know, the things that I like, I don't know. I don't know if I have one that I can think of offhand right now. But it is a good question. I mean, I think my perceptions of things have changed. Like, you know, I mean, look, when I was a kid, I loved Space 1999. I loved it when I was a kid. I loved Eagle Transporters, and the show always seemed a little too, while it was, of course, it was slowly paced when I was a kid. I can't even watch the second season of Space 1999. I still like the first season, and it actually has gotten a little bit more interesting. But the second season, like, I used to think The Bringers of Wonder, the two-parter, was so great. And I watch it now, I'm like, ooh, that's rough. That's rough. But I still like the first season. That's kind of the first thing that I thought of. Paul Gilmore sent in a tip and says, I have a friend who says he likes Star Trek Discovery if he doesn't think of it as being Star Trek. To me, that's like putting a plate of peas in front of a kid and telling them to think of it as candy. Nevertheless, it's a plate of peas. Well, you know, Star Trek Discovery even did more things, like I just couldn't get past. It asks me to believe in the mycelial network that the Discovery could travel on and go anywhere in the universe. I mean, I'm like, this is completely not based on any kind of real science. Even pseudoscience has to be believable. I'm whatever power couplings have to cause some quantum thing to do this or that. I'll buy into that. But when you take things too far, the propulsion system, the spore drive of the Discovery, I tune out. There's nothing about that I can remotely believe in. And when you've done that, I mean, one of the great things about Star Trek is they used a very easy way. You travel at warp speed, faster than light. That's how you can travel the enormous distances between planets. I believe that. That doesn't seem too much of a stretch. Transporters, I'll believe that. Even though that technology, transmuting matter, decomposing it and then recomposing it on a planet. But I'll buy into that. That's pseudoscience or that's pseudo-technology or whatever. That I'm like, okay, I can suspend my disbelief. A spore drive, can't do that. I could not suspend my disbelief when Benedict Cumberbatch beams out of the cockpit of his one-man fighter to the Klingon homeworld in Into Darkness. Because the transporter, the reason it works is it has rules. There's line of sight beaming. There's limitations on it. If there's ion storms or the shields are up or whatever, it doesn't work. I mean, if you think about how celestial navigation, the speed of light, how can you possibly beam on from one place to another? What if the weather was bad? How do you know exactly on the Klingon? The Klingon homeworld is rotating. It's also moving. So not just rotating, but moving. So how could you possibly calculate with your one-man fighter or generate the kind of power you would need to transport from Earth to the Klingon homeworld? Again, it is this kind of when the world that you've set up is completely, all of those rules are subverted just for we got to get them to the Klingon homeworld. Well, figure out a better way than that. I can't believe it. And these new you once you've done that, it's the same problem. Look, when people talked about, was it the 7th season when Daenerys came and rescued all of our characters when they were about to be attacked, destroyed by the White Walkers because somebody sent out a raven? The amount of time she had to get, the raven had to fly and then she had to fly back. That is legit. That was legit. And the amount of time after we saw how long it took to get from one place to another, suddenly distances became compressed because they needed to for the story. Well, that takes you out of the story. If you're going to spend time building up your fictional universe, you need to build up your fictional universe. You can't betray it, because when you do that, well, then you are you lose your audience. You lose your audience. People won't believe. Rosetta Allen says, this is why everyone wants to talk to your wisdom. Do they? I mean, it's very funny because I think people mistake. I'm still watching Star Trek Picard. I'm not going to not watch it. I've loved Star Trek my whole life, but it just is interesting to me because even the best writers of the Star Trek comics are like the Tipton brothers. The Tipton brothers will write a comic where you'll have all the omnipotent beings, the Organians and Q and the Metrons, whomever. They'll do a whole where they'll a goofy where everybody will pick their champions and they'll put together all the different casts and they'll pit them against each other. The Tiptons will write a goofy comic like that becomes enjoyable because they make you believe within the context of these things, and it should be goofy. But you believe. You read something like Peter David's novel Q Squared, which deals with different realities and timelines and all that. It's very well explained. And you're like, I get that. David Mack's Mirror Universe duology. Rise Like Lions, that did such a much better job of fleshing out the machinations and the origins and the characterizations in the Mirror Universe because these authors spend a lot of time thinking about this. And that's why, obviously, some of the things I'm sure Michael Chabon put into the episode last night was how, once the Borg are released from the collective and they become individuals again, they have to have they're creating a shared mythology to believe in. Well, first of all, I'd be like, why? But I think the idea was interesting. That idea was interesting. But it's not like when you're released and you start to go back to who you were. What's more interesting is that you're part of there were many different kinds of drones from all over the world, all of the universe. And it's not like they're not going to be who they were when they weren't, before they were assimilated. And I understand some people wouldn't be able to take it, and you wind up in the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, with the evil Romulan Nurse Ratchets all around you. I get all that. But the fact that I have to go, oh, it's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and that everybody gets it. It's just, anyway. Let's see. Rosetta Allen sent in another super chat. Logic and modern Star Trek are incompatible, and it's a good topic for later. Yes, I'm going to be on your podcast later, which should be fun. And you also go on and say, Spore Drive, it's talking down to the audience. It is talking down to the audience. I feel that when someone tells me there's a Spore Drive, I'm like, come on, man. I don't like that. Loquacious Precate. Am I not saying that right? I think the distinction between an EMH or holographic life form and synths is that the holographic are much easier to disable. They need a hollow projector, which can be mobile or stationary. Maybe a meaningless distinction since both require physical tech. But that's what I would say. Is it harder? If you have a holographic life form and all you need, if he's got an emitter that's this big, isn't a hologram more dangerous than a synth? Because couldn't a hologram become almost invulnerable depending on how much energy you want to expend? I mean, what if you had Romulan tech and had some kind of mini quantum singularity for your holographic troops, and your holographic troops could be transported far easier than if all you had to do is take holo emitters. You could take a whole army with you in a duffel bag, and get to where you're going, and all right, boys, here you go. And I mean, certainly that would be a smarter. As a matter of fact, why are there only holographic EMH programs? Why aren't there entire cadres of holographic soldiers? I mean, why only medical programs? They can grasp things and use tools. And I mean, again, if I was, why are there real flesh and blood Romulans? Why are there black ops troops going places when they should just be beaming people out? And everyone's like, well, there's got to be shields somewhere. Why? Why don't they, like what we saw in Insurrection, the Romulans go in and fire a little dart and use those as tags so people can be beamed up. It's all of that. If you're gonna go back, if you're gonna have 24th century tropes, and then suddenly you're gonna have a bunch of dudes run in with guns and turn it into the Western shootout of the week, it's very different from what. I mean, think about Star Trek. People just get stunned. Why isn't anyone walking in, and you walk into a room with Picard and his Romulan compatriots? Why don't you have a wide beam stun? They could do that. We saw that in the original series all the time. Why is everyone killing everybody? Why not just stun them? I don't know. It's so weird. It's bizarre. But I think, again, I don't know. If you have an EMH program, which, by the way, I thought an EMH program on a starship, when they first introduced the holographic doctor, what a great idea. What a great extrapolation on the idea of what holographic technology is. And the way they built, when they found, it was through the wormhole, they found a holographic society, Bashir or something. I mean, how interesting. That was a really, and in Voyager, hunting the holograms or whatever. All of that was very, very interesting. And you'd think, let's go in that direction. Wouldn't you? Stubble McShave sent in a tip and said, if the Romulans had strong feelings against the synths, I'd like to see an episode similar to Duet, where we really examine such issues and not just have it as set dressing or a plot device. It would be interesting to really dig down into these questions. Well, Stubble, you are a fellow reader. As we know from Stubble, he loves the Wheel of Time books. And if you're a reader of genre fiction, and not just a consumer of science fiction media, which it's a very different thing. Science fiction has all of these ideas, and I agree with you. I mean, that's another thing. All of this is predicated. They're throwing around synths, and they're saying a synth uprising. They haven't even defined really. I mean, are these Sung androids? Why not give us like a Galadriel news update, or a pseudo documentary about what happened in the intervening years? The rise of synths. I mean, they actually gave us a Picard's being interviewed for a program. Why not show us a news package that's like 5 minutes long, where we actually were brought up to speed, rather than show this incident that these synths, there was a synth uprising. Well, we don't even know what that means. Again, are there AIs that you can swallow that will take care of your heart disease? Like, I would assume so. And the idea of synths, they're only humanoid. It's such as they said of Khan, it's like the Star Trek writers, it's all two-dimensional thinking. They're not thinking on 3 dimensions about their very sci-fi concepts, and it bums me out. Entiande has an interesting take, wrote in a letter, and says, "Dear Rob, I watched the first episode of Star Trek Picard, and on first viewing I found it gripping, although on second viewing I had similar reactions to yours about Star Trek Picard retreading old Star Trek beats instead of going on a mission to explore strange new possibilities, so to speak. But then I had a thought. From a certain point of view, it makes perfect sense that issues like synthetics, the Borg, and the withdrawn Federation should be a part of the story, because that is part of the fabric of the universe set up in previous Star Trek. I agree with that. After all, if Star Trek has taught us anything, it's that we live in a universe in which new life isn't always recognized as such, or if it isn't recognized as equal, i.e. the Federation doesn't always live up to its ideals, does it? In fact, one could reasonably argue that it would have been odd if the world we were presented in Star Trek Picard, just a couple of decades after Star Trek The Next Generation, where all these issues were presented to us, was one in which those themes were not present in some way or to some degree. Perhaps the problem isn't so much that these story beats are in Star Trek Picard after all, rather the problem would be if they were the only story points in the series and the show doesn't also branch off to explore other issues." Well, I would agree with that. But here's the thing. You've already done Measure of a Man, where Data's status has been established within Federation law, and he even communicates with Bruce Maddox. And now Bruce Maddox is a villain. Since Data-like androids, whether they're Sung androids or not, have revolted. And you'd think that after establishing what let's call it case law, why do people get so dumb? I guess we're going to find out as this is all revealed to us. But anyway, my man Stephen Goggin wrote in a letter, and I love that he writes this letter in. And I'm just going to read it. As many people know, I've often said that as much of an imagination connoisseur as I am, and all you people out there, you being the Post-Geek Singularity, and you're all imagination connoisseurs, everything I like is not necessarily great. I ask all these questions, but sometimes I can overlook these things. Like, that's why I can enjoy Godzilla movies. That's why I love Pacific Rim. And that's why I love the movie Star Crash. Luigi Cozzi's, or Louis Coates, as he's known in America, Italian ripoff of Star Wars, which I dearly love for various reasons. Dear Rob and listeners, this might be a David Hasselhoff review letter, and I can blame you. I watched Star Crash, and I totally enjoyed it. If you take Captain Proton from Star Trek Voyager, give it a Blake 7 upgrade, and added a bit of the Galaga arcade game, you have Star Crash. That's a very great, I love that. What impressed me the most was how this movie is fun. I both laughed at it and laughed with it at the same time. I could see how Star Crash ripped off everything in an underhanded way, and I'm wondering, are Jar Jar Abrams and Colonel Kurtzman now ripping off Star Crash and even failing at that? I had a film on standard DVD in my library that I had not yet watched. It is an old Prism DVD collection package with 3 other movies that include Scream 3, The Shawshank Redemption, Shivers, and Witchcraft. By the way, I love Shivers. I knew nothing about the film called Witchcraft, so the day after I watched Star Crash, I found myself watching another David Hasselhoff film, which was very different to Star Crash and actually scary. I won't say too much about the plot, but it is well worth a look, and the baddies in the film are really nasty pieces of work, and the film has a nice nod to Sunset Boulevard. I like Witchcraft. Back to Star Crash. Caroline Munro was very hot, and she would have fitted in nicely with Sean Connery and Zardoz. Man, I would love to have seen that movie. One last thing. Has David Hasselhoff and William Shatner ever sang together? As always, live long and prosper. Stephen G., The Irishman in Somerset. Yours truly. I don't know. I think probably Shatner and Hasselhoff have sung together, but I not off the top of my head, I don't know. Yeah. This is an interesting letter. I like this letter. This next letter comes from, as I call it up, let's see if it's going to be, well, while I'm waiting, Ron the Good Boy sent in a very generous super chat. Thank you, Ron the Good Boy. Most satisfying Trek sequences: Deep Space Nine, the Dominion War ending battle with the defeat of the evil Weyoun and the female changeling. So satisfying, even though she regrettably gets redeemed. Agree? You know, that's true. There's a lot of great battles, and I think here's the thing about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Everyone talks about, oh, Rob, come on, Deep Space Nine subverted all of Gene Roddenberry's ideals. Look, the point of Deep Space Nine is that you had this external force, the Dominion, by the way, who didn't trust. Remember, they were a victimized race too. They had never done well with solids, and they had reason to be distrustful, and that's why they did what they did. And in the end, we were able to overcome. And Salome Jens, by the way, how great was it they got Salome Jens to play the leader of the Founders? Oh my God. Salome Jens, who was in, of course, one of the great science fiction movies of the 60s, Seconds, which, by the way, could have been an interesting basis for Star Trek Picard, sort of. I don't know how you would have done that, but it would have been interesting. Yeah. So yes, look, I love all of Deep Space, and the battles are incredible. Even when you go, it's like the die is cast when they first attack what they think is the Founders' homeworld, and they get a pasting, an Aubrentane, and the Romulan. Oh man, I love that stuff. Anyway, but yes, I do agree. Hey, Rob and all, I recently had a humorous recollection of being scared out of my wits while watching an unlikely movie to do so. Summer School. I don't think I've read this before, but somebody else wrote about Summer School. Back when I was 12, a friend and I had rented the movie one night. When I stayed over at his place, we didn't get around to watching it until late at night during a bad thunderstorm. For anyone who's not familiar with the movie, there are two funny students in the movie that love horror movies and effects, and specifically the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which they eventually get played in a class for other students to see. Well, while a scene from Texas Chainsaw Massacre was playing within the movie and the storm was raging outside, lightning struck, the hydro went out, the room became absolutely dark, and this old air conditioner's fan started making this loud decka 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 sound. This was a little too close in sound for a chainsaw for that particular moment, and I remember terror flashed over me, and my friend called out for his dad with abject fear in his voice. His dad awoke, came down the stairs, and was like, "What's the big deal?" Haha. By the way, fun movie with an excellent mock horror prank scene and effects in there. Are there any real life moments that interposed into your movie watching that caused and elevated the experience? No, but I will tell you this. I was reading Stephen King's Pet Sematary. I've told this story for before. But I'll tell it again. So I was reading Pet Sematary, and before Pet Sematary came out, I want to say it came out in 83, I think. But Pet Sematary, it took a long time for Stephen King's Pet Sematary to get published. And it was because he didn't want to release it because it terrified him. He said, it's the scariest book I ever read. It deals with the death of children. As a father, I can't handle it. And he didn't want to release it for the longest time. And of course, I was a huge Stephen King fan, still am. But you know, back in the classic period, of which I want to say Pet Sematary came out the same year as Cujo. I think it did. I'm not sure. But I was reading Pet Sematary, and of course I got it, and I was reading it. I couldn't get through it fast enough. I was sitting there reading it, and it was the scariest book I've read. I was actually scared reading Pet Sematary, and I'm reading it, and I got it like the day it came out, and there was, I was completely immersed in this book, and I was actually not sitting on my bed. I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, leaning up against my bed, and I came up for air, and literally my cat Happy, I didn't see her come in my room. I didn't I don't know. I didn't see her in my peripheral vision. I looked up, and there she was, very close to me, just staring at me. And if you know what Pet Sematary is about, the cat, the dead cat. I mean, and I screamed bloody murder. I threw the book up in the air, and my mom came running. I'm like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I was like 15 or 16, and I don't think I've ever squealed as loud. And it was so embarrassing. I mean, I had to explain to my mom. My mom does not understand how a book could scare you enough that you would scream. And poor Happy, she tore out of my room, and it was bad. So it wasn't so much a movie, but yeah, Pet Sematary was probably the first time in my life. Yeah, it was bad. And summer school, I love summer school, by the way. Summer school is great. Brian Eng, man. Brian Eng. I love Brian Eng. He's always sending in very interesting things. Rob, if a director does the same job regardless of gender, then why is Disney looking for a female director for Captain Marvel 2? So they look woke? Well, look, here's the thing. I think that having a female director directing a movie about a female superhero protagonist could only be a good thing. And I say that because there is an element of being a woman that a man is never going to understand. Like, we can extrapolate upon it. We can, as people that are storytellers, go, okay. But I think that a female director and obviously a lead female protagonist like Brie Larson or something, they could add an element that's not necessarily overt, but they could bring something to the movie that I don't think a male director would necessarily bring. And in that case, I think that's not a bad idea. One of the things I've talked about before in the show is I remember when there was a paperback line. I think it came out in the 90s called The Abyss paperback line. It was a horror paperback line, and people like Melanie Tem and Kathy Koja were writing for this. They put out books under the Abyss label. And I remember, and sometimes they would team up. People would team up. And I remember reading a lot of this female horror, and at first not digging it because it didn't seem to be as plot driven as the kind of horror, because I love horror novels, which is interesting because I really like people like Chelsea Quinn Yarborough or Anne Rice and the early Vampire Chronicles books. So, but it was just the later horror, and I had to put myself in a different mindset. I'm like, these women are approaching horror. Their hook is more emotional than it is, say, plot. And I had to sort of readjust the way I was thinking when I went into these books, and I bought them all and read them. And I liked them better. And I'm like, they were writing different kinds of horror novels than, say, the men that I was reading. And I think that what's going on is there is a lack of female directors working at the highest level in Hollywood, and I think it makes sense to have female directors come in. Apparently, was it Kathy Tan who directed? I'm not sure who directed Birds of Prey. People are saying that she's done a terrific job. And I think the more voices, the more perspectives that we're getting into these projects, the better they're going to be. And I don't think so they're looking woke, but there is definitely a lack of female directors compared to male directors and directors of color. And I think it's only better. I don't think it's so they look woke, but if you're having a female protagonist, it is a legitimate criticism to say, well, why isn't a female director directing this film? And I think, look, I think some of the humor, like in Wonder Woman, when Wonder Woman sees a baby or eats ice cream, I don't necessarily know that a male director would have put those scenes in the movie. They might have. They might have been scripted. But I think that, well, for whatever reason, Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot, when they did those scenes, when she's in England looking around in man's world, there was a certain certain innocence that I think the two of them working together conjured up that might have just been a byproduct of the two of a female director and a female actress working together, and they created those moments that felt very real and human that did not compromise the character in any way. And I think I would hope to get more of that. And I don't think it's necessarily woke so much as it is creatively. It opens up. It creates more. I think an idea to get a better perspective, which I think is good. It's good. You know, why not? This is hilarious. Dean Mikitich wrote a letter, as he is wont to do, and Dean Mikitich. Hi, Rob at the Post-Geek Singularity. The other day, I was watching one of my guilty pleasures, the Tom Selleck movie, Her Alibi. This is the first 332 shows, and no one has ever talked about Her Alibi, but here it is. For those that have never seen the film, it's not a classic, and it can be quite cheesy, but I love it. The basic premise of the film is that mystery novelist Phil Blackwood, played by Tom Selleck, has hit writer's block and has not published a book in 5 years. His publisher and friend Sam, William Daniels, tells Blackwood if he does not write a new book soon, he'll be let go. To get inspiration, Blackwood heads down to the local court to see a Romanian murder suspect named Nina, who is played by Paulina Porizkova, who was one of the great supermodels of her day, and actually not a bad actress, and instantly falls for her. Blackwood poses as a Roman Catholic priest in order to meet her, while Nina is held pending her continued arraignment. Finding her wearing a crucifix necklace, which would be forbidden in her communist homeland, he assumes she's innocent when she does not confess to the murder. With the help of Sam, Blackwood invents an alibi, we're having an affair, for Nina to secure her release. Nina then takes up residence with Blackwood, serving as the inspiration for a novel. At first, Blackwood is not 100% sure if Nina is innocent, and he's a little on the edge with fear that he could be her next victim. But before long, they're on the run from operatives from Romania's Securiat, one of whom committed the murder to stop Nina and her family's defection to America. Not a classic, but every time I watch this film, I get inspired and have the urge to get back to writing my own novel. It's something I've been doing on and off for 10 years. I've had the book planned out and the prologue and the first chapter written, but never seemed to be able to get past this. As some of you know, I'm dyslexic, so writing is not one of my strong suits, and as time has gone by, ideas have changed, and I keep going back and fixing the 2 chapters I have written. But the premise of the story has stayed the same. Maybe I should find myself a ghostwriter to help me finish. Anyway, Rob, my question to you and the PGS is this. Is there a film, TV show, or even a book that every time you watch or read it, you're given the urge to do something creative? What is it that inspires you, and what is the creative thing you do? Her Alibi inspires me to write a novel. What about you? First of all, let me say something about rewriting. Don't rewrite. Rewriting is a trap. It is a trap. If you want to write something, you got to push through. See, like you said, you've been rewriting the first 2 chapters of your novel for 10 years. Fuck that. Don't do that. If you want to write, you just start writing. You rewrite at the end, because rewriting is a trap. It's also necessary. Rewriting is the best thing you can do if you're a writer, but you have to get through the end first. And here's another thing. If you want to write your novel, do this. Write a page a day. 1 page a day. That's all you have to do. Just sit down, and if you don't want to write, dictate it. Dictate it into your phone now. You can sit there, as you're eating your dinner and dictate your page a day and download it or upload it to your computer or whatever. And after 365 days, you'll have 365 pages. They might be shite, as the British say, but you'll have it, and you will have done it, and you go back and rewrite it. 10 years have passed, and you haven't done it. Whenever I watch movies about movie making, I always want to go make movies, or I go edit something or noodle around. My favorite movies about movie making, I love Contempt. I love The Stuntman, obviously all that jazz. I love La Dolce Vita. Yeah, And whenever I watch movies about movie making, even Sunset Boulevard, I love that. I've always wanted to write a novel. That's one of my great. I want to write a horror novel, and I haven't done it yet, but maybe one day I will. I don't know. Loquacious Primate sends in a tip and says the holograms in Voyager already did mount a minor rebellion, which the EMH supported, and they were not easy to take out. It's not clear that they would have been any harder to defeat if they were Sung-type androids. I agree. That's another thing. I mean, and that was handled really, it was really interesting in Voyager. I thought it was really well done. That's why I'm saying, we already dealt with some of these topics. I mean, they've got 7 of 9. Kirsten Byers should know this. Timbula the Spider Monkey sends in a tip and says, when I read Pet Sematary, I was 15 and I was reading it very late at night. Just as Church comes back, my dog, a very old and placid Cocker Spaniel, silently walked into my room and jumped on my bed. I just about crapped my pants. My poor old dog did. I'm telling you, man, we were at that sweet spot reading Pet Sematary. That book terrified me. It was terrifying. It was legitimately terrifying. And I loved it. So, yeah. Terrifying book. So, yes, indeed. I very much appreciated that. Let's see. Other letters. Her alibi. That's what a dope letter. It's very funny. Here's an interesting letter. I like this topic. This is good. This letter comes from Mark Smith. Mark Smith asks a very practical question. Rob, 14 executive producers listed in the Picard credits seems like a really, really bad sign to me. I think there were 6 and then 8 more. Also, isn't there a Writers Guild limit on the number of credited writers? I think they had 5 listed. Mark asks, well, yeah, there are Writers Guild rules. Look, all of these shows are spinning off out of, I am sure, look, as I've always said on this show, it's not, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. It ain't show friends, it's show business. Everybody who had a hand in developing the show gets to be a creator of the show, which means you get a slice of it, and people come on, writers, they've got precedent. For instance, because my first screen credit as a producer on a movie was as I was the only single card credited producer in the main titles of Agent Cody Banks. So from now on, if I'm a producer on anything, I don't share a card with anyone. I'm a single card credited producer. If it's low budget, if it's high budget, doesn't matter. I've received that as precedent. So if you are a writer, a TV writer, and you come on board and you already have that, you've already been an EP or a co-EP or a producer on a TV show, and you get hired to come on, that's part of your deal. That's part of your precedent. So they keep adding to that. And yeah, you've got to carve out more and more money. And with a show like Star Trek, when you're bringing over the same staff you had before, then it just becomes academic. And I think it's problematic because everybody's vying for control of something. And it's a bummer. So, yeah, I think there's a way too many producers on the show. Now, here's an interesting letter that refers back to some things we've been talking about, which I think is great. This comes from Kazuya Chu from Malaysia. Hello, Mr. Burnett. Greetings from Malaysia. I recently tuned into your channel due to your coverage of the leaked screenplay for Colin Trevorrow's Duel of the Fates story. I'm writing to you now to discuss some of the points from your previous shows. In Robservations 324 on January 20th, the movie The Farewell is, like you said, made from the perspective of an American-born Chinese. Now, I'm half Chinese from Malaysia, and I can guess as to why the movie has failed. Here's my thought on it. The Chinese don't like a story told with the point of view from a person who isn't thinking like a Chinese. What I mean is, this is the mentality of a typical Chinese way of thought. Lulu Wang receives American education at a young age, so her upbringing and thinking is American. I'm not blaming education in the U.S. What I am saying is, because she grew up in the U.S., American cultural influences and changes on how she thinks. And that shows in the movie. The kind of movie will put a lot of Chinese off. I know it would. There's a difference between a Chinese person who grew up in a Western culture and those who grew up in their homeland. The same can be said to the Chinese that grew up in China, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, but some things are the same in the way we think and view things. So, in my humble opinion, I think that's why The Farewell has failed in China. I'm also disliking the live-action movie of Mulan based on the trailer itself, and I predict it will fail very badly. I like the animated version of Mulan better, although some facts were wrong, but I'll let that slide. Now on to Star Wars. Star Wars failed in China because earlier generations didn't grow up watching it. This is due to China closing its borders at the time of Star Wars A New Hope came out in 1977. Now I'm Gen X, and my mom introduced me to Star Wars. At first, I did not understand it because I was young when I first watched it, but as I grew older, I rewatched everything, including the prequels. I became a fan, and then ever since, I've played some of the games that came out at the time. Unfortunately, Star Wars novels and comics were not available in Malaysia, which is very sad. I have rewatched episodes 1 through 6 again to understand the story and the characters and enjoy it. The prequels were fun to watch. The original trilogy was very well made. But Disney's Star Wars I do not consider a sequel because it breaks all that we know about the lore in the Star Wars universe. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, is decently enjoyable, but Star Wars The Force Awakens is nostalgia hunting. I only like 2 scenes in The Force Awakens. The first is the destroyed Star Destroyer in the background as Rey rode on her desert speeder passing by it. The second is when Han and Chewie come to see the Falcon, like in the trailer. We've come home. Star Wars The Last Jedi totally destroys the character personalities and the laws of the universe, but the biggest nail in the foot is the god-awful throne room scene. I'm a martial artist, and there are a lot of stupid mistakes in the fight choreography. Luckily, I did not watch Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker and save my money for better things. That's all the pain I can think of at this moment. I'll write you again on our friendly disagreement with Kathleen Kennedy. Live long and prosper. Yes, I too like Star Trek The Next Generation. I do like Star Trek, the Kirk and the Next Generation era. Well, Kazuya, first of all, what a cool name. Kazuya is a cool name. Thanks for writing in. I love getting the foreign perspective. Very much love to hear that. And see, you and I, we can disagree, and the world is not going to come to an end. We can still be respectful. I think that's good. So, yeah. And there you go. Well, let's see. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm going to bring this chat, Robservations episode number 332, to an end. I want to thank everybody who generously supports the channel. Thank you for being here and watching. And I want to say, of course, thanks to my great moderating staff. Of course, the Honorable Mayor Mike Bodden of Riverdale, Iowa. And, of course, Detective Jim Boyers. And Greg Smith, who's building a 1-to-1 scale land speeder that he's going to debut at the Emerald City Comic Con. And, of course, Louis Yu and Jordy Lyons. And personal and confidential to Jordy Lyons' wife. I am glad Mrs. Lyons, Maria, does he sing that to you all the time? When Jordy said his wife's name was Maria, I was like, I just met a girl named... How can you not date Maria or marry Maria and not get up every morning and sing that song from West Side Story to you? And suddenly my life will never be the same again, Maria. Anyway, I'm not the song and dance man that John Campea is, but when I like my musicals, damn, I like them. But if you like these chats, please like, please subscribe, please share with your friends, and send me letters at theburnettwork.net. And all of that content, all the letters I read are up on theburnettwork.net. You can go there and write your own letters. You can write 3-word movie reviews. You can write Ian Samuels. I got a bunch of letters from Ian Samuels, but you can read Ian Samuels' Doctor Who columns on his Who View on the website. You can also read Willow Yang's letters. Willow, of course, writes Pillow Talk. Or actually, why do I always say that? My mind's in the gutter whenever I think Willow. I think about, well, I can't tell you what I think about. It's actually Willow Talk, not Pillow Talk. It's play on words. Say I just killed the joke, and I'm sorry. But I want to thank everybody for being here. I will be on the John Campea Show tomorrow, Friday, and that should be exciting. Birds of Prey opens tonight. Also exciting. I think I'll have to go check that out. And I just want to thank all of you for being here and making the show what it is, and our community what it is. Thank you very much. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. And with that, I will say to all of you, what am I going to say? If I can get to my end stream button, have a better day.